Lecture 24 is called The Age of Revolutions. This is the second part. We did the first part earlier. What did these 20th century revolutions accomplish? I'm going to give you a list of things here. They usually produce totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, regimes where power is concentrated in the hands of a few. They produce often an internal backlash, a sort of conservative reaction to the revolution. Centralized authority usually rises up to protect the revolutionary gains. Centralized authority often needs old institutions, army, police, bureaucracy, to make things run. Revolutionary leaders are often further inspired by outside interference. I can think of two examples off the top of my head. The Allied invasions of Russia at the beginning of the Soviet Union. Allied forces entered Russia to try to kill this communist government in its infancy. And this, of course, created support for the Russian communist government. And then again, you can think of the American interference in Vietnam in the 60s and in Cuba in the 60s as well. Quite often, revolutions result in the elimination of the landlord class. You can see this in China. You can see it in Russia. In Mexico, we have the emergence of a new kind of populist culture with homage paid to workers, peasants, and indigenous peoples. In Iran, a cultural reconditioning from a Western-style government to an Islamic theocracy. Revolutions generally do not occur in successful, industrialized, modern countries. A general consensus exists in these industrialized Western societies about what is and is not important. Private property, religious toleration, representative government. Generally, there's a consensus about these things, and there's no need to fight over them. And then finally, we should point out that Marxist revolutions are quite prevalent in the 20th century in Russia, in China, in North Korea, in Cuba, and other places. Marxist revolutions are not successful in the Middle East, primarily because Marxism is a materialistic philosophy. It denies the existence of God, and this doesn't mix well with Islam. Has the age of revolution ended? Well, it's an open-ended question, isn't it? Is ISIS a revolutionary force, or is it a reactionary force? Is it a modernizing factor, or does it have an infatuation with the past? With the increasing number of urban working class in China and India, will they accept their lot of low wages, oppressive working conditions, or will they turn in time to revolutionary change? We don't know the answers to these questions. I want to focus for a few minutes here on two 20th century revolutions, the Russian Revolution that created the Soviet Union, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Nazis in Germany as well. These notes are taken from a number of books in my library. Robert Galately's The Age of Social Catastrophe, Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, and of course George Kennan's classic Russia and the West under Lenin and Stalin. These examples are admittedly Eurocentric. Of course, we have to be careful with that in the world history class. But we need to focus on these examples made by the Nazis and the Soviets to understand how these practices will be copied later in the 20th century in other places. I understand also that Hitler came to power legally, so the Nazi takeover in Germany is not technically a revolution. Certainly its impact, once in power, the impact of Hitler and the Nazis was revolutionary. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes here. This is George Kennan. Kennan, of course, was a State Department official who wrote the infamous Long Telegram, which provided the strategy for the United States during the Cold War. Kennan knew Hitler and Stalin up close and personal, and he reported on them. Speaking of Hitler, Kennan says, quote, "I have spoken of the tendency in the West, flowing from the anger and aversion which Hitler aroused in the democracies, to dismiss him as someone we all know was only a mad, vicious fool. Let me reinforce what I've said about the dangers of this impression. Behind that Charlie Chaplin mustache and that truant lock of hair that always covered his forehead, behind the tirades and the sulky silences, the passionate orations, and the occasional dull, evasive stare, behind the prejudices, the cynicism, the total amorality of behavior, behind even the tendency to great occasional strategic mistakes, there lay a statesman of no mean qualities, shrewd, calculating, in many ways realistic, endowed, like Stalin, with considerable powers of dissimulation, capable of playing his cards very close to his chest when he so desired, yet bold and resolute in his decisions, and possessing one gift Stalin did not possess, the ability to rouse men to a fever pitch of personal devotion and enthusiasm by the power of the spoken word. Hitler was a dangerous man, fanatical, brutal, unreliable, capable of the most breathtaking duplicity. If it can be conceded that evil can be great, then the quality of greatness cannot, I think, be denied him." And then Kennan on Stalin. On the Russian side, there was, of course, Stalin, and let me call to mind once again his personality: cautious, secretive, hiding an iron ruthlessness under a mask of modest affability, affected by a diseased suspiciousness toward those who were his comrades and associates, but nevertheless capable of the most cold-blooded realism when it came to dealing with those whom he recognized as ideological adversaries. Stalin, curious as it sounds, was a man who was more comfortable with avowed enemies than with avowed friends. He knew better where he stood. I'm going to characterize these two, Nazi and Soviet regimes. Both the Nazis and the Soviets sought a sort of utopia for their respective nations. Racial purity for the Nazis, a classless Marxist paradise in Russia. The Soviets weren't sure at first what goals they sought as a result of the revolution. Lenin's Lieutenant Leon Trotsky sought permanent revolution, that is, taking the revolution in Russia and then spreading it westward into Europe. Lenin's other lieutenant, Joseph Stalin, pushed for socialism in one country. That is, let's see if we can make socialism work here first before we try to export it. And of course, Stalin's strategy won out. Trotsky was exiled and then later murdered by Stalin. The Marxist-based revolution became more national in character with Stalin's victory instead of being class-based, as was Trotsky's preference. In other words, the revolution in Russia became more nationalistic because it was socialism in one country, Russia, as opposed to being exported to Europe. Both the Nazis and the Soviets took root in the chaos following the Great War. And you remember that Russia and Germany were both defeated in World War I. In Europe, the ideological clash between Nazism and communism added an entirely new dimension to the conflict that had engulfed the same nations during the Great War. And here we're looking ahead a little bit to the Second World War. There was a new viciousness as the armed forces threw aside the conventions of war, and national and ethnic hatreds roared out of control. Ethnic cleansing, population transfers, deliberate targeting of civilians, and mass crimes became the order of the day, and we'll get into this more later. One way or another, every country on the continent became entangled in this Holocaust. In the 1930s, the struggle between communism and Nazism became a deadly rivalry for world domination. It was above all this clash that led to the darkest chapters of a great social and political catastrophe of the century. Here, not only the Holocaust, but other mass killings before and during the Second World War. And we'll discuss this more when we get to the World War II. Far from being populist, Stalin and Lenin before him were self-proclaimed leaders of a vanguard. They did not appeal to public opinion, nor did they try to build upon the popular mood. Even in their own minds, they derived their legitimacy and their authority, not from the people, but from Marxism and the laws of history, of which they supposedly had superior knowledge. Hitler, on the other hand, had nothing but contempt for the Soviet-style dictators and the terror they used on their own people. In stark contrast, Hitler set out to win over the hearts and minds of all non-Jewish Germans in a sort of communal bonding based on the exclusion of Jews and other people that were deemed racially unfit. Hitler held stubbornly to the view that the Jews, as a people with no homeland of their own, had no stake in belonging to the nation because their real interests lay elsewhere, with capitalism or with communism. Above all, Hitler despised the universal claims of communism. His movement, like his regime, saw itself anchored in blood and soil, in the here and now, even as it preached a future utopia for racially fit Germans. For Lenin and Stalin, mastery of both peasants and nations was a grand ambition indeed, and the Bolsheviks concealed its major implication, that they were enemies of their own people, whether defined by class or by nation. Lenin and Stalin believed that the society they governed was historically defunct, a bookmark to be removed before a page was turned. Lenin and Stalin took for granted that the Soviet countryside would soon have to finance its own destruction. But where to find the initial capital for the traumatic transition from an agrarian to an industrial economy? A way would have to be found to extract a surplus from the peasants. The surplus could then be sold for foreign currency needed to import machinery, needed to modernize the country, in other words. Like the Bolsheviks, the Nazis rejected democracy, but in the name of a leader who could best express the will of the race, not in the name of a party that understood the flow of history. In 1933, the Soviet and Nazi governments shared the appearance of a capacity to respond to the Great Depression. The other Western democracies did not demonstrate this capacity, at least not until Roosevelt, perhaps, in the New Deal. Both of these regimes, these revolutionary regimes, radiated dynamism during the Great Depression. Again, when other countries appeared helpless in the face of economic catastrophe. Hitler and Stalin, for all their many differences, presumed that one root of the problem was the agricultural sector, and that the solution was dramatic state intervention. The German agricultural question could be resolved not within Germany, but abroad, by taking fertile land from the Polish and Soviet peasants, who would be starved, assimilated, deported, or enslaved. Rather than importing grain from the East, Germany would export its farmers to the East and colonize Eastern Europe and the western part of Russia. During collectivization in the early 1930s, Stalin treated the campaign against his own peasants as a war for their grain. Hitler counted on a victory in a future war to feed Germany from the same place, Ukraine. The Soviet program was made in the name of universal principles. The Nazi plan was for a massive conquest in the East and Russia for the benefit of the master race and their farmers. Hitler intended to seize the Ukrainian breadbasket. Stalin, who had served his revolution, or served during the revolution in Ukraine, regarded the land in much the same way. Ukrainian farmland and its peasants were to be exploited in the making of the modern industrial state. Hitler looked upon Stalin's collectivization as a disastrous failure and presented it as proof of the failure of Soviet communism. But he had no doubt that German farmers could make Ukraine a land of milk and honey. The Stalinists colonized their own country, and the Nazis colonized, occupied Soviet Ukraine. and the inhabitants of Ukraine suffered and suffered and suffered. During the years that both Stalin and Hitler were in power, more people were killed in Ukraine than anywhere else in the bloodlands or in Europe or in the world. The Nazi and Stalinist systems must be compared, not so much to understand that one or the other, but to understand our times and what our species is capable of. Let's draw some conclusions here. The Cambodian Revolution of the mid-1970s, we see Stalinist methods being carried out here, wholesale population transfers, an attempt to modernize the country with great loss of life, millions of people dead. Communist rebels seeking to cleanse the country of class distinctions while boosting agricultural production, forced urban dwellers into the countryside to work as farm laborers. You may have heard or seen the film The Killing Fields, which deals with the Cambodian revolution and disaster. Millions, like I said, died as a result. Of course, in Rwanda in the mid-1990s, the Hutus slaughtered between 800,000 and 900,000 Tutsis with whom they shared this country, often shared families. This took place in a 3-month period. It was not done systematically like Hitler with the gas chambers or like Stalin with executions. It was done with machetes, personal, up close, face to face. Of course, in the mid-90s, the Serbians killed thousands of Bosnian Muslims in the Yugoslav Civil War to achieve religious uniformity, in addition to political power. So you can readily see that the examples set by Stalin and Hitler resounded across the rest of the 20th century. And of course, when we talk about the Second World War, we'll touch on seeing some of these things again. Thank you.